Welcome back to Hillary PC's Thursday Night Candidate Forum. Tonight's guest is Dianne Morales, a Democratic candidate for mayor of the city of New York. I met Dianne at a rally in front of the Lucerne Hotel, where she was advocating in support of the rights of homeless individuals and against politically motivated shelter reassignments. After speaking with Dianne for only a few minutes, I learned that she is a fierce advocate for change, urging improvements in education and housing, and advocating in support of reforming our police and ending income inequality. Before becoming a candidate for mayor, Dianne, who has master's degrees in social work and in education administration, and I emphasize those degrees as a shout out to my wife, Lori, who has an MSW and works in the school system. Dianne worked for the Department of Education, helping to create the Office of Youth Development and School Community Services, and serves as its chief of operations. Dianne has also served as the director of the Teaching Commission, was a founding member of Jumpstart, a national early childhood nonprofit organization, served as executive director of The Door, a youth development organization, the executive director and chief executive officer of Phipps Neighborhoods in the South Bronx, a Bronx social service organization that fights poverty, and currently serves on the board of the New York City Human Services Council and the Community Schools Advisory Board. I'm exhausted just reading this. Currently, Dianne is a Democratic candidate for mayor of the city of New York. We have a great deal to cover. So without further introduction, it is my great pleasure to introduce Dianne Morales. And Dianne, where are you? There you are. Hi.
Hi, sorry about that. I'm having a little bit of internet trouble. I'm sorry. Oh. Hi, Michael. How are you?
Good to see you. I have to tell you, not to make anyone nervous, but I would say about 5 minutes before I got on to the Zoom broadcast, my computer was crashed. I couldn't get anything working. I started sending my links to other computers to try to, at the last minute, get this going. So believe me, the whole Zoom process is really tough. But I'm glad you got it nailed down and that you're ready.
Yeah.
Can you hear me okay?
Okay. Yeah, I can hear you. You're just freezing up on me. I'm hoping that it's just a temporary glitch and that it'll all be fine.
Wonderful. All right. I'm going to jump right in with our talk today. We're going to cover a lot of interesting territory, and a lot of it is on, I would say, on your home turf. So let's get started. The first thing I want to talk about with you, as I talk about with everyone on this forum, is housing and homelessness. New York City, as you know, is the wealthiest city in the world. Yet New York City currently has nearly 80,000 homeless men, women, and children. Yesterday, you tweeted that as mayor, you will declare affordable housing as a human right. Can you not hear me?
Yeah, no, can you start over? I'm sorry.
No worries, no worries. So I'm going to begin with discussing housing and homelessness. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. New York is the wealthiest city in the world, yet New York City currently has nearly 80,000 homeless men, women, and children. Yesterday, you tweeted that as mayor, you will declare affordable housing as a human right and partner with communities to guarantee affordable housing for all. How will you do that? Will you incentivize developers through upzoned zoning districts? Or will you use housing bonuses to incentivize private development that also includes affordable housing? Or are you more interested in pursuing public funding and housing through increases in the housing budget, or perhaps converting the temporary shelter hotels into permanent facilities? What's your solution?
Oh, that's a softball. It's almost like you read my platform. So as you said, I am committed to declaring housing as a human right. I think that we have seen over the course of the last year, if not before that there's an inextricable link between housing stability, mental health, and public safety. And we've got to actually provide for everyone's ability to have access to stable, secure, safe housing. So one of the first things I've committed to is that in the first 100 days, I am going to actually move towards executing housing as a human right. And that's going to include appointing a deputy mayor who's going to be responsible for leading and coordinating a citywide cross-sector effort to address the housing issues and the opportunity issues and social mobility. That's going to, as you referenced, it's going to include doing things like converting hotels and recently vacant hotels into permanent housing, providing supportive housing, and really focusing first on our homeless and our housing insecure. We've got to move away from what I've referred to, and I've heard some of the folks reference to as the shelter industrial complex, which right now spends about $3 billion a year in keeping, in temporary doesn't help anybody feel secure, and actually doesn't always result in the acquisition or securing of permanent supportive or affordable housing. So we need to move that into prioritize those dollars and those resources into permanent and affordable housing. The other thing I'll say, I can go on about this forever, is that we need to move away from the way we've done housing in New York City. The orientation and who's been prioritized has been luxury developers. And we give them what I've referred in an earlier forum on homelessness, we give them kickbacks. The technical term, the legal term is tax subsidies or incentives, right? But in fact, it is a kickback. And the ROI, the return on investment that the city gets for that in terms of affordable housing, which is not really affordable to anyone, is just a small fraction of what in fact we're giving away to what I've started to call more recently corporate welfare. We are very easily rewarding large-scale developers with millions and billions of dollars rather than investing and prioritizing our communities. So I've called for actually the redirection of those dollars into community-led initiatives, partnerships with trustworthy, nonprofit, affordable housing developers and other providers, so that we could in fact dramatically expand the availability of secure and permanently affordable housing for all.
So just so that I understand this correctly, so one of the ways you can help fund the public housing is one of the ways you're going to try to fund public housing is to stop in a sense funding and subsidizing private developers to give meager like crumbs to
right.
affordable housing at the same time preventing developers from basically getting wealthy by building just luxury high rises.
That's right. I mean, there is a sort of the economic model for how we've been doing housing for far too long prioritizes, a very small fragment of New Yorkers, while so many New Yorkers are struggling with the rising cost of rent, increasing housing security and homelessness. And we really need to prioritize. Everything about my platform speaks to the idea of prioritizing the people that are struggling the most and making sure that our resources are targeting the idea of elevating those folks so that everybody gets access to opportunity to live in dignity.
Well, let's talk about the SOHO rezoning then, because SOHO rezoning has some elements of what you're talking about. Those who are in favor of the SOHO rezoning talk about the affordable housing units that are supposed to be created. But of the total units that are being created, it's approximately 8 to 900 out of 3,500 units. So those who have been critical of the plan have pointed out that you're really not actually providing the level of affordable and supportive housing that's necessary to alleviate the mass homelessness and the lack of affordable housing in the city. And the expense, the cost that the city pays is the upzoning of an iconic neighborhood. Where do you stand on that?
Right. So, the reality of it is that the city does need deeply affordable housing in what have been considered central, high opportunity communities that don't have that much of it today, right? We need to actually move towards the idea of equal distribution of resource and access for everybody. And, so the SOHO rezoning would add some affordable housing to two of the most expensive neighborhoods in the city, and it would create some, opportunity for people. But the reality of it is that this is actually, the MIH, mandatory inclusionary housing, is such a deeply flawed program that really leaves so much more value on the table than we get back, right? So this goes back to my comment about, return on investments, and really sort of how we could create models of housing and development that really meet the needs of New Yorkers, as opposed to some of these sort of much more, I think, superficial or kind of tinkering around the edges types programs that really don't get to the crux of the need. And so, this rezoning, I believe, would really also open the door for larger department stores, and we need to sort of think about how we would protect our smaller businesses in that idea. Overall, what this is a reflection of is the need for us to transform the ULURP process as well, and how it is that we are looking at and making determinations about land use and what role is the community playing, and how is that also balanced with what I said before about the distribution of resources across the city in a different kind of way. I think that there's a lot of room for improvement here. The sort of idea, the intent is laudable, but the impact is not quite there.
So just so we're clear about the Soho rezoning, do you support it, or do you support it with changes, or do you oppose it?
I oppose it as is. I really think that we kind of need to go back to the drawing board, if I'm being totally honest.
Oh, and that's the best way to be. That's the best way to be. So you mentioned ULURP. ULURP, for those people who don't traffic in land use and zoning minutia, is the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure. I live in ULURP, so I know it very well. And I love that you said that you're looking to reform the ULURP process. It's not on my list of questions or outline, but I'm dying to know how, because I love the idea of reforming ULURP. How do we reform ULURP to make it a more, so we can democratize the process and give communities a greater say in how their neighborhoods are developed?
Yeah, so for those who are, thanks for pointing out that I was getting steeped in the jargon, and not everybody spends their days thinking about these things or mired in it. So ULURP essentially right now, the way it works, and this is going to be an overly simplified description, but I think it works. The way the process works now is we're supposed to have an opportunity, community members are supposed to have an opportunity to weigh in on and examine how land in a particular community might be repurposed or rezoned or utilized. The way it happens right now is consistent with what I was talking about in terms of the housing model. The developers are in the lead. The developers kind of drive that process, and they sort of work out their deals, and then they present the what's been planned to the community, and the community is left in a position of trying to scramble to negotiate for something in return or in exchange for what's already kind of a train that's left the station, essentially. And it really puts the community in a position where they are, getting crumbs for a significant thing that's being given away from the community, right? So part of what I think about when I think about a democratized ULURP process that puts the community in the forefront is really the idea of truly community-driven processes where the developers are responding to the community and not the other way around.
Right.
And that involves also putting city resources into that process so that community members can actually be involved and be informed, and all of our sort of partners in the community around what it is that we need, what it is that we want. How does that balance with the sort of larger overall distribution of things across the city? And then the developer gets to come in and respond to what the community is outlining. It is flipping.
You support a community process.
Absolutely.
Would you support the addition of floating members of the City Planning Commission that would be representative from various communities that are being rezoned? So, for example, on the Soho rezoning, if that were to show up at the CPC, the City Planning Commission, during the ULURP process, instead of having a series of mayoral appointees, most of whom, if not all of whom, have no connection whatsoever with the community, would you support the idea of having a floating either 2 or 3 member block for each community that happens to be rezoned, so that the City Planning Commission would be more representative of the city?
Yeah, I mean, this is just one example of a mechanism from the city that needs to be sort of revisited in order to make sure that the representation is truly reflective of the impacted communities and truly balanced, right? So yes, I think it's really important for the people that are being most directly impacted to have a leading voice, and to really be able to weigh in on things that are going to impact them in the long run. Because that's just not been what we've done.
Right, because at the CPC, at the City Planning Commission, members of the community get to speak for 2-3 minutes to get everything out. And we all know what that's like. The community members get up, they speak as quickly as they can. The City Planning Commission, nods their head, they're reading their phones, they're looking around. And before you know it, the area has been, there's been an approval from CPC, and it's on its way up to the chain.
Right, and that's, I mean, that's another example of sort of the community being in the back seat, right? And the community not actually having, you know, being in the driver's seat, which is one of the things I think is a critical transformation that needs to happen.
Excellent. All right, that's very helpful. Well, let me ask you one last question. We've been bouncing back and forth between housing and zoning, but that's just the nature of a dialogue between two people who obviously know the issue. I want to talk to you about getting back to affordable housing.
Yeah.
One of the unaddressed issues when it comes to low and middle income housing is the definition of area median income, which is,
Yes.
for the viewers who are familiar with this, is the level at which household income will determine eligibility for housing. When the AMI is set too high, low and middle income earners can't afford to live in the low and middle income housing that's been created for them.
Yep.
As the mayor, what would you do to ensure that when the federal government sets the AMI, it's set at a level such that low and middle income low and middle income earners can actually afford the housing that's being created for them?
Yeah. So, you know, I think that we should be fighting so that our most, you know, New Yorkers who are struggling the most and, you know, really not millionaires and billionaires, so that none of them are paying more than 30% of their income on housing. You know, I think, you know, what I have called for actually is dramatically expanding social housing in New York City. We have a perfect model of that in NYCHA, although, you know, there's a lot of room there for improvement from a physical infrastructure perspective. But when you think about a social housing model, you know, that is a really good beginning. And so
you grew up in NYCHA housing, didn't you?
So I didn't grow up in NYCHA. My parents lived in NYCHA. I am the youngest of three by almost a generation. My sisters are 10 and 9 years older than me. And so by the time I came around, we were out of NYCHA. NYCHA had done exactly what it was intended to do, right, initially, which was really to sort of provide an opportunity to stabilize and then move on.
Right.
And so my parents actually benefited from that. And by the time I came along, they were living in a different apartment. But, you know, I've called for actually, you know, the idea of us using city land and making sure that all city land is used exclusively for the development of affordable housing, and doing that in, you know, expanding community land trusts so that, again, communities are much more in the driver's seat, and really moving towards a model of having no one pay more than 30% of their income, no matter what their, you know, income is on the lower end, on housing.
And so getting the federal government to make sure that the AMI is sufficiently low, or at an appropriate level, I should say, so that low and middle income earners can afford it. How would you go about doing that as mayor? Because as the mayor, you'll have considerable power. I mean, after all, New York City is New York City. How would
It is New York City. Yeah.
How would you use that mantle of power to make sure that the AMI was set at an affordable level?
Yeah. So, you know, one of the things I've said is that you're right? The mayor of New York City is the mayor of New York City. The mayor of New York City also has the opportunity to lead nationally. And I'm betting on the idea that there are a lot of other mayors across this country that are struggling with similar issues, and that we could actually organize. I'm an organizer also, right? That we could organize and build a coalition of mayors across the country that have shared values around this and a shared vision around this. And that we could take that, you know, I always talk about, I'm not going to Albany by myself. I'm not going to DC by myself. I am going with busloads of other people who, you know, believe in this vision, and believe in how it is that we need to move toward providing access and opportunity for people to live in dignity. And I think this is a key issue that I would be happy to tap into my organizer skills to bring to DC and advocate for. I also think, you know, we've gotten lucky over the last couple of years. We've got some representatives down there that see things, you know, through a similar lens. So I'm hoping to leverage those resources as well.
And I like the idea of unionizing our cities so that we can collectively make a better impression on Washington.
Yeah.
All right, let's
don't tell anybody I said that yet, though.
Okay, well, that'll be our secret.
That'll be our secret.
Let's turn now to privatization of public resources. About 7 years ago, then public advocate Bill de Blasio urged New Yorkers to support him because he would prevent the privatization of public assets, which had become a central feature of the Bloomberg administration. A prime example of this is the New York Public Library, where the number of hours per week has gone from 80 to 56 hours, and that's even before COVID. Now, critics have contended that the reduction of hours is to allow the New York Public Library to be used for private events such as weddings and corporate parties for the wealthy. To that end, the New York Public Library, with the support of the de Blasio administration, has granted an application to the Landmarks Preservation Commission to change the configuration of the interior of the library to accommodate catering elevators and loading bays to increase efficiencies for food service. Now, do you support the use of our libraries for private events, or should the library simply be a public resource for public people?
This is an interesting topic. So, you know, I certainly believe that public resources should be available to the public, period, full stop. I do wonder, I hadn't thought about this, to be honest. I do wonder about whether or not there is value to generating some revenue for the city in the off hours. If that is something that, you know, that makes sense, right? I think what that, you know, if we're talking about libraries exclusively or museums exclusively, that might make sense.
Actually, in multiple, it happened, for example, at the Frick, for example, just completely reconfigured its interior to accommodate a restaurant. And as a consequence, they had to sacrifice the oldest chamber music room left in North America. And they sacrificed that in order to accommodate a restaurant.
That's different. Okay, I see what you're saying.
Has a huge dining hall, which is beautiful.
Right.
But you know, you're cutting away gallery space, and for the library, you lose reading rooms and places to staff.
No, I was thinking about existing space, right? I wasn't thinking about, you know, the extent to which some of these public resources would be reconfigured in order to do something else, right? I'm thinking just, this is the space, this is what it is, and how do we leverage this space during off hours, right, to potentially generate revenue? I think that is more reasonable,
right?
But the idea of transforming space, because then profit might become the driver, right? And I think that's one of the issues we have to combat. So that we are preserving public space for public purpose and for the public, period. So, you know, it's a needle to thread, it sounds like, but I think it's possible to do that. It's a question of what kinds of limitations and restrictions you're putting on, you know, the ability to change the spaces, the physical spaces, and mitigate the harm, right? Because to me, that seems harmful.
Right. I can imagine that if there are public spaces in the city that are simply being left fallow on off hours, the city may be able to use it. But to cannibalize the space and to change function in order to accommodate corporate events and weddings and bar mitzvahs, that's a whole different kettle of fish, in my view.
Right. Yep. The generation of profit. That's really what it is, right? I mean, we're talking about, reconfiguring and transforming, not in the best way possible, public spaces, otherwise public spaces in the interest of profit. And I think that's problematic.
And you would support the restoration of the library being open 80 hours a week as it was for decades and decades until the de Blasio administration, as opposed to what it is now, which is 56 hours a week, including no hours on Sundays?
Yeah, I mean, we saw in the at the height of the pandemic, we saw the families in particular who didn't have access to internet, sitting outside the libraries so that they could access the internet from the library, right? We've seen the value, I think, in a whole different kind of way throughout the course of the pandemic of public spaces in general, quite frankly, but our libraries in particular. And so I think we need to be working towards expanding the availability and the access to those resources rather than restricting it.
Right. That's great. Let's now talk, since we're talking about the library, that sort of is a natural segue towards landmark preservation. Landmark preservation has undergone some significant changes in the last 7 years. Just to give you a sense of perspective, before Mayor de Blasio became Mayor de Blasio, landmark preservation was less than 10% of my practice. At one point, it was up to 70% of my practice because of all the approvals that were going through. One of the more recent approvals that's raised the ire of preservationists and real hardcore New Yorkers is the idea of constructing a 1,600-foot tall hotel directly adjacent to the Grand Central Terminal, the Grand Central Station. And but the Landmarks Preservation Commission's perspective on this has been is, well, the hotel is not a landmark property. Only Grand Central is, and our jurisdiction is only on landmark properties. We can't control an adjacent property. The same thing is going on downtown on East 4th Street on the Merchants House Museum, which is one of the oldest landmarks in the city. The same thing's going on there. They want to put up a large commercial building next door. And the problem is, as soon as they start digging down, the rubble foundation upon which the Merchants House is constructed could give way and create structural compromise. So my question for you is, should the Landmarks Preservation Commission have jurisdiction, not just over the buildings that are designated, but also over any adjacent buildings which, if constructed or developed, could harm the landmark buildings?
Okay, so this is a really interesting topic, and I'll tell you what my thoughts are on this. Landmarks preservation, we know, is responsible for preserving these historically, architecturally, and culturally significant buildings. Landmarking, though, is also often used to prevent development in largely white neighborhoods in our city. I can tell you this, you know why? Because my neighborhood of Bed-Stuy was just recently landmarked. Just a couple of years ago. It would never have been landmarked. I grew up in Bed-Stuy. It would never have been landmarked in the 70s. There's something to be said for the architecture and the preservation of that architecture. Right. But the process for how landmarking happens, I think, can be problematic, and I think we need to really take a hard look at that. We've seen that. We've seen it played out. The flip side of that is, I know, in recent months, maybe last fall, we got 227 Duffield Street in Brooklyn. Yep. Right? Do you know it? Okay. Sure, right. Landmarked, right? It used to be a site in the Underground Railroad for folks who don't know. So there's a balance, I think, that we have to establish in terms of really preserving legitimately important sites like 227, like Grand Central, and also making sure that it's not used as a tool to stop development in rich, wealthy white communities in particular. And so I think, there's something to be said for looking at the qualifications that are utilized to, consider whether or not a building should be landmarked or a community should be landmarked to ensure that there's cultural equity, right? I mean, everything that I talk about on my platform is based on equity and justice. Making sure that the Landmarks Preservation Commission, the members, are actually, much more diverse and have an understanding of the way, many culturally significant landmarks shape the communities and impact the communities, and also kind of making sure that we are, doing whatever we need to do to make it much more difficult, if not impossible, for just white community members who, want to stop the development of affordable housing by landmarking their community, right? So I think that there's a way we need to sort of figure out a balance of both, but there are definitely things that are worth fighting for from a landmarking perspective. That thing that you were talking about in terms of next to Grand Central, the tower, we don't want, it's really important to preserve things that are, Grand Central is both a public space and a landmark, right? It is an iconic sort of New York City landmark. Yep. So I think there's a lot of value to preserving landmarking as a tool. I think we need to really kind of be clear about the distinctions between when it's appropriate and when it's not.
Right. I will tell you that one of the most satisfying victories we had over the de Blasio administration was back in, I think it was 2016, where we preserved the Hopper-Gibbons house, which is the last known intact shelter point of the Underground Railroad left in Manhattan. They were going to put an apartment right across the rooftop where freedom seekers were trying to escape to go to Canada. And they were going to put a big apartment across the escape route. And when we objected, the response we got was, well, we'll put a plaque in front of the building. I'm like, that's not landmark preservation. And no, there's no question that there needs to be a level of cultural diversity in the designation of landmarks and historic districts in the city. And there's no question about that. But what I'm really focusing on is the extent to which we want to make sure that once we've designated an important site like Grand Central Terminal, like the Hopper Gibbons House, like 227 Duffield, that we
Right.
preserve it by ensuring that the buildings that go up around it don't either overwhelm it as a resource or
Right.
worse, cause structural harm, which it sounds to me like you
Agreed.
support some sort of
Agreed.
restriction, some sort of regulation.
Yeah. Yes. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Let's
Absolutely. We're on the
let's
same
talk
page.
about the Board of Standards and Appeals. Board of Standards and Appeals. Those people
Okay.
don't know, that's the zoning board in New York. It is the bastion of all wealthy developers who go there and basically get what they want. Currently, 95% of applications before the Board of Standards and Appeals to obtain a variance from the zoning resolution are approved, which essentially means if you're a wealthy developer, the exception has become the rule and you get what you
Yep.
want. Now, critics of the BSA contend that it's reflective of institutional bias at the BSA in favor of developers, but those who support development respond by saying, no, 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 the approval rate is simply the BSA weeding out the meritless applications, and that's why most of the applications that get to the board are so favorable and so appropriate. What do you think about the BSA? Does it work, or is it institutionally biased?
We know that the members of the BSA are appointed by the mayor, and they're, subject to advice and consent from the city council. We know that community boards can submit comments on, and they can weigh in, and but it's just advisory, right? It's not. We also know, as you just described, that the BSA wields an enormous amount of power that tends to side with developers and landlords.
Right.
So, I think, one of the things we've talked about on my campaign is the idea of giving the council power to, over BSA decisions, right? Reviewing power over those decisions, and making sure also that we know who the members are, who's being, appointed to the BSA, and what their ties are, what their networks are, whether where their allegiances are, right? I think is a really important. And I'm being very diplomatic.
Well, the current chair is a former real estate lobbyist. So that's when people ask me, I say that's like putting a co-executive in charge of the EPA. As mayor, what communities and what backgrounds would you look to ensure that the BSA is not only professionally diverse, but ethnically and culturally diverse?
I mean, at the center of everything for me is impacted communities. I mean, we need to make sure that we are having diverse representation from across the city, of communities that have been impacted, and it's balanced, right, with people who might be steeped in issues of housing and development, but that the community members are also getting the education that they need to understand the process, to understand the impact of these decisions, and to understand sort of, the all of it from a racial lens to an environmental lens to an economic lens, and really being able to balance the way decisions are being made, so that we are focusing on equity, and real justice for communities, that rather than these how shall I say, these paternalistic relationships that don't benefit everybody equally.
Right. So, but you do support the idea of creating a broad and diverse group of backgrounds on the BSA to ensure that neighborhoods are going to be well represented, as opposed to just having, for example, most people, I think all but one of the members of the BSA is from Manhattan right now. You'd want to be sure that there's a diversity geographically, diversity of backgrounds, diversity of cultural and racial backgrounds as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'm committed to doing that, and exploring ways to do that as mayor. I understand also, we need to. It's going to require looking at the charter, right? Because the charter has certain requirements for the BSA members.
You have to have an engineer. You have to have an architect.
Right. I mean, I think it's possible to have an engineer and an architect, and whatever sort of the requirements are that are aligned, right? That have a shared vision. but I also think it's important to diversify that, and that might require making some changes.
Now, we talked earlier about having City Planning Commission having floating members from communities that are affected by decisions. I asked you the same question about the BSA. Right now, there are 5 members. If we add 2, that makes that ensures there won't be NIMBYism, right? Not in my backyardism. So they can't veto projects, but they will have more of an influence than just 3 minutes. Do you support the idea of creating floating members for the BSA?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly support that idea. I think, again, I'd want to look into whatever the charter issues are around that to expand that. I think the idea of expanding representation is definitely one worth pursuing.
Right. I can tell you every person who's been asked that question on this forum has said, yes, it's something we need to do. And I'm glad to see that you also support it. It would make the BSA a lot more functional than it is right now. All right, let's now turn to the issue of Intro 2186, which is a city council resolution designed to create a sort of universal urban plan in the city. There are some who like the idea because, after all, right now, urban planning essentially consists of which developer gets which approval of which building in which neighborhood, and who knows the mayor best, as opposed to a centralized urban plan. The other side of that coin, however, is some have argued that by placing so much power, by concentrating so much power in the head of this new urban planning unit, we could be creating another Robert Moses. And in that respect, really ending the democratization that ULURP is supposed to create, and that these meetings before the BSA and the LPC are supposed to engender. So what do you think? Do you support 2186? Do you think it should be changed? Do you oppose it?
I think there's a lot about the sort of plan that is a step forward, if you will. I think there's some improvements there. The idea of comprehensive planning, I think, is something that is sorely needed in the city. I'm not sure that it goes far enough quite in terms of some of the things I was talking about earlier, in terms of the role, where the community sits in this process, and who's driving this process, and who's leading this process, really. I'm not sure that it really goes as far as I would have it go, in terms of empowering communities to, initiate their own land use plans, for example, which is something that I think is really important to do moving forward. It's a decade-long plan for, an immediate crisis. And that's also, there's a sense of urgency that I think is lacking on that. And it still provides for a certain amount of incentives for developers, to stay within the city plan, as opposed to really prioritizing protections for communities, which I think is so critical to me in anything that we do moving forward.
Well, you've said that you believe in a community-driven urban plan. And so if that's the perspective, which I happen to share, by the way, then my instinct is that 2186, while in the abstract is a good idea because we do need an urban plan, the idea of centralizing a lot of power at the top as opposed to building from the bottom is probably something you would encourage change. In other words, you like the idea of an urban plan, but you don't want to have one that's driven at the top. It should be coming from the bottom.
That's right. I like the idea of comprehensive, right? Really sort of, factoring in a comprehensive thinking, but communities should be driving, communities should be leading, right? Everything we do moving forward should be from the ground up. And I don't think that it does nearly enough to put communities in the driver's seat.
Excellent. All right. I'm going to shift gears and address one last issue before we get to our speed round. First of all, thanks very much. This has been a very informative talk, and I know it's going to help change hearts and minds here. I want to talk to you about policing and stop and frisk. This became a major issue during the debate last week, and I saw Maya Wiley and Eric Adams get into it, and you had a lot to say about it as well. So I guess the first question is, Eric Adams has taken the position that stop and frisk has a role in the city, and you don't. Tell me why Eric Adams is wrong and you're right on this.
Because the data supports it. I mean, when you look at the percentage of Black and brown people stopped that were found to, in fact, be guilty of something,
Right.
versus the percentage of white people that were stopped that were found to be guilty of something, actually it's higher in the white community. But the number of people in the white community that were stopped is a fraction
Right.
of the Black and brown folks that are stopped. And the Black and brown community is actually harmed by policing. There, you know, this is not a casual sort of interaction. That, you know, that we have demonstrated numbers and data and videos. How much more harm do we have to inflict upon Black and brown communities before we recognize that policing is inherently racist, and that is not the answer to creating safe communities. So I am not interested in looking at ways to expand policing. I am interested in looking at ways to expand safety for New Yorkers.
Well, and what if Eric Adams were on this broadcast right now, what he would say is the way to expand safety is through reformed but increased police presence. How do you respond to that?
How I respond to that is that the safest communities that any of us could think of, if I had us go through an exercise of closing our eyes and envisioning the safest communities we've ever been to, those are not communities that have been heavily policed, and that what we do know is that communities that are heavily policed are also the ones that are most harmed. And the last thing I'll say on this particular question is that if there was in fact a correlation between policing and safety, we would be the safest city in the world, because we are the most heavily financed, most heavily militarized, and the largest police force. So if there was a correlation between policing and safety, we would be really safe. And everything that has happened in this city is happening on the NYPD's watch, despite the fact that they are the largest and most militarized police force in the world. So we actually need to stop, it's the definition of insanity when you keep doing the same thing over and over again, you expect something to change. Policing is not gonna result in safety for us. We actually need to address people's basic human needs, access to housing, access to food security, because that's actually been dramatically impacted, access to healthcare, which we failed to provide our communities in the middle of a pandemic, and quality schools.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. This has been a very productive talk. I want to turn to our speed round now. So
okay.
Fasten your seatbelt. Here we go. This is just an opportunity for members of the community to get a sense of who you are, not so much as a candidate, but as Dianne. So let's get to it. Okay. Some of these questions are ridiculous, and some of them are not. Okay. Number one, Knicks or Nets?
Knicks.
I'm right there with you, Dianne. Okay. Number two, if there were one person whose leadership style you'd like to adopt as your own, whose would it be?
Ooh. Leadership style. I mean, I am a big admirer of Shirley Chisholm for a lot of different reasons. Trailblazer, pioneer.
It's funny, Maya Wiley said the same person, actually. Okay, I can ask you this because you are a social worker. So who is your favorite children's book author, or what is your favorite children's book?
Oh, so the first name that popped into my head was Shel Silverstein.
Okay.
And the first book that popped into my head was The Giving Tree.
A personal favorite. That's how I taught my kids how to read, because the word tree keeps coming up over and over. Spelling tree, eventually they get it down. Okay, here's another one. Saturday Night Live, still funny, or is it time for a change?
Oh, it's such time for a change.
Yeah.
Although they do have some superstars, but it's time for change.
I'm right there with you. Do you play a musical instrument? And if so, what is it?
Oh, wow, no one's asked me a question like this. This is a great one. So I feel like I can't say I play a musical instrument because I'm terrible at it, but I went through a real sort of folksy stage in my college after college years. And so I own 2 guitars, and I was self-taught, acoustic guitars. I was self-taught.
What kind of guitars?
acoustic.
No, I know, but I'm a guitarist. I was a musician before I was a lawyer, so.
Are you really?
I
don't. You
was,
know what?
yeah.
I don't remember the brand. I
Okay,
haven't
no
actually
worries, no
touched
worries.
them in a long time.
You got to
But
pick
I
them up,
love it.
Diane. You got to play them.
I know. I know. I used to be so proud of the calluses on my fingertips when I when I was doing that.
Okay.
So yeah, I did. I tried to teach myself guitar for a couple of years.
Okay, that's great. Who's your favorite superhero?
Ooh, my favorite superhero. It's probably Chala from. Do you know what I'm talking about? What's the name of the movie? I'm
Shala.
terrible.
Is that a Marvel?
It's yeah.
Oh,
It's the actor that we lost. Black Panther.
Black Panther. Oh, yes, yes. Black Panther,
Yes.
of course. Yes, yes. Somebody just actually sent in a note onto the chat. Black Panther. Yes.
Yes. Thank you.
Okay. I'm not asking this because it just happens to be in the frame of the picture that I'm looking at, but this is on my list. Plants, safe with you, or are they on death row?
They're on death row. I feel really badly, but yeah, I try. I'm just not
I
my
hear you.
thing.
Yeah, listen.
I love them. I
Yeah.
love them. I just,
They shudder in
can't.
fear when they enter the house. Gotcha. Mac or PC?
For years I thought I would never go Mac, but once you go Mac, you never go back. So I'm a Mac girl.
Okay, very good. If you had to give up pizza or ice cream, which would it be?
Oh, that's just cruel. Um, I guess it would be ice cream. I guess
Okay.
I would be so I'm a single mom, and every Friday for the last 20 years has been pizza night at my house.
The reason I ask this question always is I used to work at a Haagen-Dazs for 6 years in a high school and college, and I developed a terrible allergy to dairy products. So I haven't had pizza in over 30 years. I haven't had ice cream in over 30 years. So I always want to know, for me, giving up pizza would be I couldn't do it. But I did, I guess. But pizza was the worst. But I always am curious because a lot of people are real ice cream people, but it sounds like you're a pizza.
No, no pizza. I mean, that's my keeper. I mean, I love ice cream too, which is why I thought that was a particularly cruel question. But
all of these questions, except for the Knicks and Nets, were cruel. I have to say. Which recording artist from your iPhone or however you keep your music would we be most surprised to find is on your list? Like, is Johnny Cash on your list?
That's a really good question. Can I peek?
Yes, you absolutely can peek. Sure.
Can I peek? Because I think it'd be fun to to pull one up. Avril Lavigne.
Avril Lavigne. Okay. You're right. That would be on my list of. I'm surprised you like Avril Lavigne. Actually, I'm sure she's terrific. I've
at some point I did. So, but that was easy. Yeah.
My daughter used to like Avril Lavigne when she was growing up.
Exactly, which is why your daughter's probably a little bit younger than me.
Yeah, she's younger. Okay, and lastly, which is your preferred print news source? You can give up to 3 answers. Print news.
Print news. Print news. Who does print news anymore?
Well, you got the Times, you got the Post, you got the Daily News, you got Newsday.
None of the above. None of the above. I like Newsweek.
Newsweek, okay. What else?
Print news. Wow, Michael, you really got me on that.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
The Amsterdam News.
Okay, Amsterdam News.
The Amsterdam News.
Hey, listen, you don't have to give 3. Newsweek and Amsterdam News. Those are
there you go.
There you go. Very good. All right. Well, listen, that was our speed round. I'm sorry I tripped you up on the ice cream question. I know that was the worst one of all.
You traumatized me with that one.
I did, right? Okay. I'm getting questions. I get questions on my phone and by email while these things are going on. And I have a question about your statement earlier this week with regard to Israel. You came out with a very strong statement on Israel, and I'll read the question. Yes. Why is Israel an apartheid state?
In my experience, Palestinians do not have freedom of movement. They do not have free, access to utilities. It is controlled elsewhere. I think that the way in which they are restricted speaks to apartheid, essentially, unfortunately.
The comment that in this question that I got was that Israeli Arabs have the right to vote, have the right to serve in the Knesset, and have a seat on the Israeli Supreme Court. How is it apartheid?
That's Israeli Arabs, right? Are we talking about Palestinians?
Right. So what you're saying is that
not the same thing.
Okay, so just so that so I understand the answer. So Israeli Arabs may not be subjected to apartheid, but from your perspective, Palestinians are.
That is correct.
Okay, very good. All right, let me see the next question here. Sorry about this. Unfortunately, sometimes they text it to my telephone, so it's very difficult to.
No worries.
follow.
The other thing I'll say about the sort of apartheid thing, is that it's not one of those things that it's just kind of like my sort of crazy opinion, right? It's, my statements about the ongoing apartheid in Israel Palestine is aligned with, legal observers and scholars and human rights organizations, including many in Israel. So I just, I want to make sure that folks aren't conflating my statement with sort of just characterizing it as something that only I am saying. It is something that has been sort of acknowledged and claimed by other groups as well.
Okay. The next question is about education. The question is, class size in New York City public schools has increased every year. How are you going to reduce class size and ensure that their number of teachers relative to students is appropriate for education of our children?
Yep. So we need to expand the number of teachers for sure. One of the things I've called for in terms of beginning to reduce class size, there are a couple of things actually I've called for. One is adopting a 12-month calendar, much like California does, where students would still go to school for just 9 months, but we could fold in the summer months, which would allow for, sort of the distribution of students throughout the course of the 12 months as opposed to just the 9 months. The other thing I think we need to look at is a staggered school day, where our younger ones would go to school in the morning. We know developmentally little ones learn best first thing in the morning. Once you get to be about 12 or 13, you don't really wake up in the morning in the same way that you do when you're 5 or 6. And you don't really start learning until 10 a.m. or so, right? If you're a parent of a young adult, you know this, you've had this experience. So our older students could easily start the day later in the day. I think that is actually some things that we should be thinking about as a city in terms of moving out of the old box for how we do education, which we know is just not working for so many of our students anyway. And then actually obviously adding additional teachers. The other thing that I've sort of thought about during the course of the pandemic is whether or not we should be incorporating our school-based partnerships, community-based organizations, arts and cultural institutions, many of whom often partner with schools and offer services and supports in schools, and who also have facilities that have better infrastructure than many of our schools and technology and those kinds of things, as sort of an opportunity to expand the footprint of our education system.
So one of the issues you raised about staggering over the school year, which over the 12-month calendar, which makes a lot of sense in some respects, but the concern would be that there are a lot of schools that don't have any air conditioning at all.
Yep.
And which kids are getting that much trouble so they have to go to school,
Right.
from July and August?
Right.
How do you work out the infrastructure issue with respect to having air conditioning so that the schools are livable? And also, how do you decide which kids have to stay in school over the summer as opposed to being, in wintertime?
I mean, I think, so a couple of things I'll say about this is the air conditioning issue you raised is just a fraction of the infrastructure issues that our school buildings have to deal with, right? I mean, we saw this past winter with, with COVID, how, teachers had to try to keep their windows open and their students are freezing. So, there's ventilation issues,
Right.
both, in terms of heat and cold, and just, windows, no windows, those kinds of things. So I think the infrastructure issue has to be something that we do regardless, right? Whether we're talking about a year-round school,
Right.
a school year-round thing or not. It is a significant challenge that requires significant investment. So that we have to do regardless.
We have to find money. How are we going to fund? Because you're right. I agree with you. Both
Yeah.
my kids went to public school in New York City. I think a public school education is critical, and I know that you feel that way as well.
Yeah.
But to actually fix the physical plant of the number of schools that I think we have 1,400 elementary schools in the city alone. How are we going to do that with the budget issues that we currently have?
Yeah. Well, so the Fair Student Funding Formula is very exciting. The fact that we just got that fully funded, that is an exciting thing to see what we can do with those resources. I definitely think, obviously, we need to make investments in the infrastructure of our schools. I am curious I don't know that, our city agencies and the Department of Education in particular utilizes the budget that they do have in the best way possible. We have seen over the course of the last 8 years in particular, the executive level of the Department of Education really grow exponentially. I'm not sure that that's, my prioritization would be either to make sure that as many of the dollars as possible are going directly to the students and impacting students directly on a day-to-day basis, or that we're doing things like strengthening the infrastructure, which also has a direct impact on students' experiences on a day-to-day basis. I think there's a lot of room there to
Sure. No, I mean, but the key obviously is we have to find ways to find money. One of the issues that we could probably do is talk about raising taxes on people who can afford to spend the money. And also, I mean, there are lots of different ways for us to deal with it. Another way is perhaps to start to bring business back to the city so that we can increase our commercial tax base so that we can afford so many of the things that right now are becoming unaffordable. One of the downsides to the Bloomberg administration, the de Blasio administration, one of the many, is that we've lost, like the financial district is becoming a residential area. And residential real estate taxes are just going to be a lot lower than the commercial tax base and how we can bring in money that way. So something else to think about in terms of raising revenue, because we desperately need to do that.
Yes, we do.
And you also mentioned one other thing about this, which was to stagger the school day. I just want to follow up on that. So how would that work in terms of, and I realize you haven't figured out, the entire plan down to the last, crossing the T and dotting the I. But in terms of, we have a teachers union here in New York City. And there are specific rules in terms of how many days they work, how many hours they devote to continuing education for themselves. And I think it's called continuing development. My wife's going to kill me that I can't think of the term. But in any event, how do we do it so that we can, number one, increase teacher pay because they are vastly underpaid, while at the same time making more of them available so that we can increase the number of teachers and then reduce the student-teacher ratio?
Yeah. So I think the Fair Student Funding Formula is going to help a lot in terms of that. I think, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of making sure that we're thinning the top layers and actually, really directing and targeting those resources down to the classroom level, and that means teachers, right? I mean, teachers should be rewarded for their labor in proportionate ways to the impact that we know that educators have on our students' lives. So, I think that's critical. And I'm also investing and committed to expanding the teacher workforce and the teacher training pipeline, actually. So I've talked about how we diversify the teacher pool, so that our teachers are actually more reflective of the students that they're serving. And I know for a fact that as someone who ran school-based programs for over a decade, that a lot of the staff that I had in my organizations that were doing work in schools were much more reflective of the students that we were serving, and they had opportunities like through CUNY, which is part of what I'm proposing as well, a K through 16 system that would have partnerships, cross-sector partnerships, where we could actually create a teacher pipeline from those very folks that are already working in schools, already, linguistically and culturally appropriate, and just need the access to the training and the opportunities to become teachers.
Excellent, excellent. We are just out of time, but we covered a lot of territory. I want to thank you so much. And for those people who are watching, I want to emphasize that Dianne was at a protest supporting the people at Stonewall today, and she left that to do this forum. And I do appreciate the time that you put to this.
Thank you.
If you want to tell everybody where your website is, I haven't been doing this. I should be doing it. Tell everybody how they can find out more about you.
Sure. So you can check out our website at www.dianne, D-I-A-N-N-E, there's 2 N's in my name, .nyc. That's our website. You can learn more about my platform, sign up to volunteer, make a contribution. And you can also follow us across all social media platforms. My account is Dianne, D-I-A-N-N-E, the number 4, NYC, Dianne for NYC, across all social media.
Wonderful. Listen, Dianne, thank you very much. I look forward to seeing you out on the trail.
Michael.
And to everyone else, stay tuned next week. Next Thursday, we'll be back again on for Hillary PC's Thursday Night Forum. Thanks again, Dianne. Have a great night and good luck.
Thank you. Stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.